In this video, we're going to start looking at the different parts of the cell, beginning with with membranes. So what is a membrane from the biology point of view, the cell biology point of view? A membrane is made up of a lipid bilayer. Lipid bilayer, bi means two, so a lipid bilayer is just two layers of lipids. You remember lipids are hydrophobic molecules, and specifically lipid bilayers are made up of two layers of phospholipids. We talked about phospholipids in the lipids video. They have a glycerol backbone. Remember, glycerol had 3 carbons. So we had 2 fatty acid tails that attach to 2 of those carbons, and those fatty acid tails are hydrophobic. They don't like water. And then we had a phosphate group that attached to the 3rd carbon, and then there might be something else attached to the phosphate group. We're not worried about that for this class. So the head part of the molecule is hydrophilic. It likes to mix with water. The tail part of the molecule is hydrophobic. And that property of phospholipids is what enables it to form these really special membranes that create the outside of the cell and the outside of the different organelles. You might see the word amphipathic in the textbook. Amphipathic means a molecule that has a part that is hydrophobic and a part that is hydrophilic. So phospholipids are amphipathic molecules. We also said in the lipids video that lipid bilayers include cholesterol. So cholesterol is another kind of lipid, and it can wedge in between those fatty acid tails in the bilayer, and cholesterol in the membranes of the cell help make them just the right amount of flexible. And we said that, well, first I want to remind you this is shown in 2 dimensions, but think about this as happening in like 3 dimensions, right? So you end up, like if you're thinking about the whole cell, the cell membrane, you end up with like a sphere of phospholipids, all of them with their heads pointing outward. And then inside of that sphere, a sphere of phospholipids, all of them with their heads pointing inward. And the tails of both of the spheres meet in the middle. So what you get is a layer of fat, or of at least fatty acids, sandwiched between 2 layers of the parts of the molecule that like water. And that fatty layer is able to prevent things, at least some things, from passing through from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, or vice versa. So it plays a really important role in separating the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, and that's all because of these cool amphipathic properties of these phospholipids in the membrane. So besides phospholipids and cholesterol, you will also find lots of different proteins in cell membranes. We will talk about all these different things that proteins do later. Just for now, all I want you to know is that cell membranes also contain proteins that have all sorts of different jobs. And another thing that you'll find in cell membranes is carbohydrates. So especially on the outside of the cell, you'll see carbohydrate chains being attached to either lipids or proteins, and those carbohydrates can serve different functions, like they help one cell recognize another cell or bind to another cell sometimes, for example. But the components, I just want you to have this whole picture of the components of a membrane. So phospholipids, cholesterol, proteins, and carbohydrate chains, especially on the outside. And again, let's talk about the role of a membrane, especially the outside membrane of the cell. So the outside membrane of the cell is called the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane. And the job of that membrane is to separate the outside environment of the cell from the inside of the cell. And this feature is what gives cells the ability to maintain life and maintain all of the chemical reactions that enable life. So if you can concentrate things like sugars and enzymes and proteins and all the different molecules on the inside of the cell, then you can start to have them at like a high enough density to have these chemical reactions that create metabolism and things like that. So membranes are actually really, really important to maintaining living things. You can also keep things that you don't want outside of the cell. So separating the inside from the outside is the key role of a membrane. Like that. Keep the blue things in, keep the gray things out. And then the membranes in organelles actually serve a similar function. So organelles are kind of analogous to an organ in the body. You know how an organ in your body, like your liver, has like a certain function, which is like maybe to like detoxify things, you know? An organelle is a little piece of the cell that has a certain job to do. And organelles also, or membrane-bound organelles anyway, have membranes around them. And the job of a membrane-bound organelle's membrane is similar to the job of a cell membrane. It's to separate the outside of the organelle from the inside of the organelle. So an organelle like, let's see, there's an organelle called a lysosome that's involved in digesting stuff inside the cell. The lysosome wants to have those digestive enzymes on the inside, not on the outside, because otherwise it would digest the whole cell, and that wouldn't do anyone any good. It'd be like if your stomach acid was all over your body. So the membrane of the organelle keeps the stuff that should be in the organelle, like those enzymes in the lysosome, inside, and it keeps the stuff we don't want in the organelle, like in that case, anything we don't want to digest, on the outside. And so again, membranes play that role of separating inside from outside. We said that prokaryotic cells don't have membrane-bound organelles. And to clarify, so an organelle, again, is like anything that does a special job in the cell. So we'll be talking about ribosomes. Ribosomes are little protein RNA complexes that help make proteins. So ribosomes are considered an organelle because they're a specialized part of a cell that has a job. But they are not considered membrane-bound organelles because they're not wrapped up in a membrane. So prokaryotic cells do not have membrane-bound organelles. They do have ribosomes, so they do have some organelles. They're just not wrapped up in membranes. Okay, so prokaryotic cells have that cell membrane on the outside. Eukaryotic cells have lots of cell membranes on the inside as well, or lots of membranes anyway on the inside as well. And so I think I used this analogy before, but I like to think of a prokaryotic cell as a bag of stuff. There's just the membrane on the outside. Sometimes there's like two membranes on the outside, but like right next to each other. And then, but there's no membrane-bound organelles inside of that. Eukaryotic cells I like to think of as bags of stuff. So each organelle has its own job and has its own membrane, and then they're all contained within the membrane that is the larger cell membrane. And this is that animal cell picture you saw before. So the cell membrane or the plasma membrane is the yellow orangish thing on the outside here. It's kind of potato shaped, I think, in this picture. So that's the membrane on the outside of the cell. And then you can see all of the convoluted folding layers of membrane in all of the organelles on the inside of the cell, right? So the purplish blue one is the nucleus. So it's got a kind of a double membrane on the outside. The blue around that is the endoplasmic reticulum. The sort of turquoisey one is the Golgi apparatus. The yellow-orange ones over toward the left are the mitochondria. So lots and lots of membranes on the inside of a eukaryotic cell. And we call a set of these organelles that we'll be talking about in more detail as we go, we call it the endomembrane system. So that includes like the nuclear envelope or the membrane around the nucleus, the membranes that are around the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, the plasma membrane, and then some other organelles like lysosomes. Basically, all of these organelles in the endomembrane system can kind of exchange membrane with each other. So even though they're different organelles and they're surrounded by their own membranes in some cases, Some of them are continuous, like the membrane of the nucleus connects to the membrane of the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Anyway, we'll talk about all that. All I'm trying to get across here is that these organelles can actually exchange pieces of membrane with each other. So like a little piece of the rough endoplasmic reticulum can bubble off and float over to the Golgi apparatus and merge with the Golgi apparatus, and then the Golgi apparatus can bubble off another little piece of membrane and it can go over to the plasma membrane and it can merge with the plasma membrane, or the plasma membrane can pinch in a piece of membrane. So even though these organelles are different and some of them have like totally kind of separate membranes from each other, that membrane material is constantly being exchanged back and forth throughout the cell. All right, one last little bit on membranes here is the idea of the extracellular matrix. So back to the plasma membrane, or the membrane that surrounds the cell. On the outside of cells, there's often a protein carbohydrate matrix, we call it, of like just all these different fibers that give the cell sort of something to anchor onto, to kind of hold onto, and kind of keep its place in the body, say. So in this picture on the bottom, there's a little blood vessel, a capillary. That capillary is surrounded by cells. And then those like green fibers that kind of look like blades of grass in this picture, those are just different fibers of the extracellular matrix here. So those fibers are not part of the cell, they're outside of the cell, but you can see that that mesenchymal cell, that blue-green cell in the middle, is grabbing onto those fibers at different places. And so it's kind of keeping its place in between the other components in this picture, so that just the extracellular matrix is the matrix of fibers that surrounds the outside of the cell. And this is just a more zoomed in picture. So you can see here we've got that lipid bilayer, we've got the proteins in the lipid bilayer, we've got some carbohydrates attached to the lipid bilayer, and then we've got these protein or carbohydrate fibers in that blue space that represents like the outside of the cell. So the cell, all those proteins in the membrane and stuff can kind of latch on to that extracellular matrix to kind of hold that cell in place. And that's your introduction to membranes.